So, I hope you're all suitably freaked out. My name's Jen Robinson. I'm Director of Legal Advocacy for the Bertha Foundation and Legal Advisor to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. I want to welcome you all here this evening to the preview screening of Citizenfour, a brilliant film by Laura Poitras. And we have a fantastic, somewhat surprising panel this evening. We're going to be talking about the film. We're joined tonight by Jimmy Wales, Wikipedia, free speech activist and entrepreneur, and Eric Knight from Privacy International, an organisation here in the UK that's doing work on holding our government to account for surveillance. Now, I was asked this evening to provide my personal reflections on this film, and I should do this in full disclosure. But first I'd like to say that this is an exciting preview screening. The film opens on Friday. It opened last week in the United States to record screenings. Please turn on your surveillance devices that you all have and hashtag Citizenfour, because we'd really like to see this film get out there and be seen by as many people as possible. But in full disclosure, I think this is one of the most important films of our time, not just because of its coverage of the surveillance issue, but for what it says about whistleblowers. And as I said in full disclosure, I work for the Bertha Foundation. We were one of the first investors in this film. But beyond that, for my own work with WikiLeaks, I've known Laura for a number of years when she first started filming on this particular issue, filming around WikiLeaks, and was in fact part of the footage that became the program, her op-doc on the New York Times website, that resulted in Snowden contacting her. And the work that she's done has been incredibly important. This film is incredibly important because Edward Snowden is incredibly important. For the example that this shows about the way that whistleblowers are pursued, and the success story that I think his case shows, both in terms of the win that he claims in getting this information out there and letting the American public and the international public know about what's happening with surveillance, but also to show that whistleblowers don't always end up in a prison, and that he is continuing to live something of a life. It's important to note that if he were in the United States, there is an indictment for him. Espionage charges have been brought, unauthorised use of government information. And if he were to return to the US, irrespective of the public interest in the disclosures, and we're going to talk about that, what we've seen in this film, he would be convicted because there's no public interest defence for those kinds of disclosures. And I'm incredibly proud to represent WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks played an incredibly important role in ensuring his freedom and continued safety. And if it weren't for WikiLeaks' role in assisting him, he may well be in a prison today. But we're joined by an eminent panel. We'd like to take a few questions from you at the end. But first I'd like to start with Eric. Tell us a little bit about Privacy International's work in terms of holding government to account. First, explain to us, because I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand what it is that GCHQ is doing. Bring this back to the UK and let's talk about what it is exactly that GCHQ is doing and what it is you're doing to hold them to account for the disclosures that Snowden's made available to us.
Thanks. So Privacy International is an NGO based here in London. We've been working on state surveillance issues for the last 22 years. I must admit, while we've been doing it for 22 years, it's only been in the last 4 or 5 years we've really been able to get traction on some of these issues. And I'm delighted that we've been able to fight on these issues in the last year and a half, thanks to Edward Snowden. The material that we found out about, thanks to Edward Snowden, has caused a sea change in our ability to affect change on what's happening here. Our intelligence agencies have been running on autopilot almost for the last 70 years, since they really came into existence. And about 10 or so years ago, the operational landscape of these agencies fundamentally shifted. The capability that they had to intercept all of our communications became possible. And all of a sudden, their lack of oversight, the lack of legal frameworks that were in place, gave them carte blanche to our private communications. You asked, what do we think GCHQ are doing? I mean, now we don't think it's what we know GCHQ are doing. You saw in the film a GCHQ program called Tempora. This is GCHQ intercepting every single communication, every email that you send, every website that you visit, every phone call that you make that goes over TCP/IP and that goes through these cables can get captured, automatically scanned, filtered, and analyzed. This happens automatically. The safeguards that we have here in the United Kingdom barely touch collection activities. The only safeguards that exist pertain at a far later stage, which is whether or not GCHQ can search for your name individually. Something that we found can be easily circumvented when you think about the power that data mining computation has on these kinds of activities. Earlier this week, Privacy International received very, very sad news. There were 6 companies that provided GCHQ with blanket access to their undersea fiber optic cables. These are the companies that allow GCHQ to do their mass surveillance, and they're companies that you all know. This is Vodafone, this is BT. These are home brand companies, and they handed over all of your private information to GCHQ, going far beyond what the law legally required them to do. This is mass surveillance, this is blanket surveillance, and we asked the national contact point here in the United Kingdom to look at this issue and say, are these companies respecting fundamental human rights standards? And to our dismay, just yesterday we found out that the government have refused that legal challenge on the basis that they will not confirm or deny the veracity of the Snowden documents. They don't think the Snowden documents are good enough to show that these companies have handed over every single communication that you've had. This is a huge issue and a huge problem, and it's an issue that our governments are still refusing to confront here. Privacy International are battling in the IPT, a secret court, to fight for all of your rights, saying that GCHQ can only spy on people when it's both necessary and proportionate, with a strong legal framework in place. And we're having to make our case on hypothetical facts. The government will refuse to admit that these are activities that they're doing, and they're refusing to admit that the Snowden documents are real. So we're playing a game of almost in dreamland when we're making submissions saying, in theory, should a program called Tempora exist, would it be lawful? And you get situations in which the judge ends up asking. We had a fantastic moment in a case a couple of weeks ago where the judge asked the GCHQ's lawyer, do I pronounce it tempora or tempura? And the GCHQ lawyer, the government lawyer, stood up in very serious face and said, well, I of course cannot possibly confirm or deny the pronunciation of any alleged program. And that's the state that we're in.
Don't you think it's interesting, because there's been I could talk about these legal cases all day, but it's interesting because the WikiLeaks cables have been admitted as evidence before the courts, and it's almost ridiculous that Snowden material is now so widely publicised and known, but they're still denying the existence of it. But let's talk more about before we get into the technicality of what these legal cases mean, does it really matter? Is it not moot when we talk about regulatory arbitrage and how effectively it doesn't matter whether you need to get a warrant or not, because the US government can spy on me as an Australian citizen wherever I am and share that information through the information sharing that the Five O's conducts with my government, the Australian government, and my government of residency, the UK, effectively making the warrant system and the civil liberties protections that we have moot.
Hollow.
So what does that mean in terms of our protections and in terms of your work?
So we've got a real issue with spying laws as they exist, because they're predicated on the idea that GCHQ will not spy on people in Britain, but they can spy on anyone else anywhere in the world. Now NSA has the same thing. They say we're not going to spy on Americans, but we can spy on anyone anywhere else in the rest of the world. But there's no law that is preventing the agencies from swapping that data. And it turns out that's what they're doing. The reality is that you should all be just as concerned about NSA getting your data as you should about GCHQ. And this fundamentally discriminatory law, because that is what it is. There is no reason not to afford a Frenchman the same protections as someone else in the UK when the state is violating those rights within their territory. They can absolutely provide those same kind of protections. And our governments are making completely the wrong policy and moral point on this. Because in doing so, in saying that the rest of the world is a free-for-all and we're only going to protect the Brits, it means that no other state is going to afford any protections for us here. Now, when you combine that with the fact that, unfortunately, the states just trade this information, and I encourage you to pick up a newspaper tomorrow because we're putting out a press release tonight that is revealing the extent to which these practices are happening. And I can assure you that whatever reassurances you've received from the British government in the last year, regrettably, they are not as strong as they could be. This is an issue that needs to be addressed, and going to secret courts to fight these points is not good enough. Going to governments to say, deal with these issues where they give misleading statements is not good enough. Our agencies need to change on this. I think this film is going to be a really strong way to get a whole series of people that haven't previously been looking at this interested and caring and seeing that reality. And I really hope that they do.
And Jimmy, I want to come to you because famously Wikipedia changed its business practices and the way that it operates, I understand, in response to the Snowden revelations. What does this mean for business and for protection of consumers in terms of protection of data and protecting us from these kinds of interferences?
Yeah, I mean, well, I would say one of the most important things to understand about all of this is that encryption works. The math is real, and it's the best and only real defense we have. Obviously, the legal frameworks, the oversight, all of these things need to be modernized and improved, and there's loads of work to do there. But in the meantime, as consumers, one of the things we should really be demanding of every internet service that we're using is that it's as encrypted as possible. So from a simple user's point of view, when you go to your bank and you look up at the URL, it says HTTPS, you should expect to see that everywhere you go on the web. And obviously there's weaker and stronger versions of this, that, and the other, and we can get into the technical details. But at the end of the day, encryption is incredibly important. So one of the things that we did in response to all this is to encrypt all connections to Wikipedia. So in the past, if you were accessing Wikipedia, which is generally not the most secret thing that you do, on the other hand, maybe it is for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. We know how many people throughout history, going back to Alan Turing, and that's another great film you should see, have been threatened or persecuted or blackmailed over their sexuality. And so how many young people having questions about their sexuality go and they go in to read in Wikipedia to say, I'm trying to learn, I'm trying to understand my life. And that becomes a nugget of very personal information that could be used against that person later on should they become a politician or something like that. Hopefully we're a little bit past that stage of society where outing someone destroys their career, but still, who knows what. And so, from my view, what you're reading, what you're learning, what you're thinking about is very personal. It's a fundamental human right to have a space of privacy around that. And so what that means for us is, well, now, when you visit Wikipedia, they can see that you're talking to Wikipedia, but that's not generally all that incriminating. But they can't tell what you're reading. This should be the case everywhere. What news stories you're reading. And it used to be the case. I would say 10 years ago, everybody said, well, we can't do that, it's too expensive. And it was. It does take a little bit more computing power. And then actually Google, I remember reading this amazing Google engineer blog some years ago when they decided to encrypt all of the connections to Gmail, and they realized actually it's not that expensive anymore. And so when this happened, I went to our engineers and I said, all right, listen, I want to encrypt everything. How much is that going to cost? And I'm going to go talk to some rich people and I'm going to get the money to do it. And they're like, actually, it's just a couple of servers. Really don't worry about the cost. So we moved in that direction very quickly.
And was that in a direct connotation to Snowden revelations?
It was on our timetable anyway. It wasn't something that we were really thinking that much about. This definitely put it on the agenda. And in particular, there was one slide of sort of I forget the exact title. It was like websites that are easy to spy on is what it felt like to us. And there was Wikipedia listed, and our engineers were like, fuck you. And so basically, it was hard to stop them from doing anything else for about a week as they recalibrated everything to encrypt all the connections.
So another thing we can thank Snowden for. But
well, and there are other aspects. I mean, one of the things that has happened, so we don't know all the details. We heard about having direct access into servers, and I think it may be 50 years before everybody finds the true history of what's been going on. But one of the things we did find out is that they were tapping into the data connections between Google data centers. And Google, they're very good at security and so forth. One big weakness, they assumed that the data lines that they owned cables from them to their next data center, they didn't have to worry about those. They suddenly realized everything that goes out of their physical premises, they have to assume that some spook in a truck is going to tap into it. And so now they encrypt all of the links between their data centers. Yahoo similarly has beefed up their internal security. And that's really important. And it's the kind of thing that's very hard for us consumers to see and have insight into, but it's something that we should be asking about. What are your data practices? What are your security practices? It's really incredibly important.
Absolutely. I wonder how you would reflect, though, that's speaking to Wikipedia's own experience and decisions in response to the Snowden revelations, but how do you reflect more broadly on business practices? We've heard a lot about whether certain companies allow backdoors, know about those backdoors into their technology that allow access to their consumer information. How should we be approaching this? And how should we reflect on it?
In general, we have, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know all the legal details, but for example, your health information cannot be shared with third parties without your explicit permission. That's the default. That should be the default for all of your information. That's just the one simple thing to say. Companies shouldn't be able to sign a deal with the government to give a backdoor and give them all of the data without you being explicitly informed of that fact. I think that's really, really quite important.
We've now got an opportunity to really ask of these fundamental protections to be put in place by these companies. Security hasn't always been the biggest priority for a number of technology companies because, one, it costs a lot of money, and also there hasn't been historically a huge amount of demand for people because people don't know how to evaluate it and understand it. It's complicated, it's tricky. But I think the example of going to Wikipedia is a really interesting one, right? So you would be, I hope, shocked and outraged if the government had permanent access to every single thing that you looked at your local library, and that they could get warrantless access to all of that information and scour that and go through it. Why should it be the case that simply because you're visiting the world's largest encyclopedia and it happens to be located outside the UK, that warrantless access to that material can be got to? And I think it's these kinds of justifications that allow us to see how the analogies kind of domestically that in physical life that we can understand begin to apply online. Companies, I hope, are going to begin to start reflecting what we expect of them and fighting back against this. One of the truths, the ugly truths, is that for many companies, they've been complicit for far too long. And this is the problem that we've got with our telecommunications companies. They've been providing this access now for a good number of years, and they're going to have to come clean and confront their previous failures and say, we're going to fix this, and we're going to fix this now going forward.
Can you explain briefly, just for the audience, what it is that these telco companies have been doing and providing, and what that means for us as individuals?
So, while you might remember a US congressman or senator, I can't remember who it was, a few years ago, said that the internet is a series of tubes. And everyone mocked him and everyone laughed at him. In truth, he wasn't completely off the mark, because the reality is that while we think of the internet as this kind of thing that exists wirelessly and somehow in some clouds, it still fundamentally exists on hardware, and this hardware is connected by cables, and these cables are fiber optic cables that are run by companies that we know about. 90-95% of the world's communications flow through these undersea fiber optic cables that allow us to email at lightning fast speed and search the web and everything else. And these cables are owned by companies, BT, Vodafone. And if these companies hand over, if they provide blanket access to allow GCHQ to tap those cables and get a feed of whatever they want from it, then it doesn't matter if you're going to a service provider further down the line, someone like Google or someone like that. If you get it at that point, at that source, you get the raw, unrefined material that you've got. Every single thing that you touch. You open your phone and you do anything on it, chances are it's going to be going through one of these cables. And that is what these companies have handed over on your behalf without a fight.
So I'd like to take some questions. I think we've heard some very interesting points this evening about what we as consumers and what we as citizens can ask of our governments. But do we have any questions?
Shall I shout? sort of clarification, and maybe there's someone from the production who could help. I noticed HBO were partners to the film. Sheila Evans, great person, but HBO, Time Warner, AOL, Time Magazine, there's quite a lot of big corporate interests there. I just wondered what sort of influence they might have had on the film, if any.
Well, none of us on the panel were directly involved in the film, but speaking to Laura's independence as a filmmaker, I can say none. Confidently say none.
Could you elaborate on why Laura can't enter the country?
Laura has, I think many of you will remember that Glenn Greenwald's partner, David Miranda was stopped here under Schedule 7, which is Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act, which allows the UK government very broad powers to stop anyone that they suspect of, very broadly defined, being involved in terrorism. That's a strict liability offence. So if you're stopped by immigration and police officials at the border and asked any questions and you refuse to answer them, which as a journalist you well should, because you are protecting your sources and shouldn't disclose to the authorities who you've been meeting with and why you've been meeting with them, that's a strict liability offence. Now, David Miranda was caught under that. The High Court sanctioned that as being legal under our laws here. That is subject to appeal, and I hope that's overturned on appeal. But for Laura, particularly in the context of what you saw in the later revelations of this film, both in respect of her work with Snowden and what we saw happen to David Miranda, and now that we know that they've been approached by additional a source or sources who are providing additional national security information to them, she is at risk, and is at risk of arrest, and is at risk of, if she comes into the country and is stopped and is questioned, then being found guilty on effectively a strict liability terrorism offence. This, I think, this law has been heavily criticised, and Eric, you might want to speak to that as well, but I think it raises grave questions about the nature of democracy in the UK. So that's why Laura will not come back, and she'll have to be Skyping in for all of the Q&As in relation to this film. And not just Laura, Glenn Greenwald also refuses to come back to this country because of that. And what a grave shame that is, I think, for the UK.
This question is directed at James. What is it that we can do as individuals in terms of educating ourselves, in terms of dealing with the issues that have come up in this film?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some things you can look into. I would look into Tor, which is a way of anonymously browsing the web. Tor Bundle is really easy to use. It used to be quite hard to set up Tor, but you just download Tor Bundle. Things like just pay attention when you're on different websites as to whether the connection is encrypted or not. And if you have any relationship to them, just send them an email and say, hey, why isn't it encrypted? Just so they know there's consumer demand for this kind of thing. The sad thing is the chilling effect of my next piece of advice, which is be careful what you do and say online. And that's a horrible, horrible thing to think and to worry about, that something you may say amongst friends in a chat room could somehow be made to look bad in the future. I don't want people to censor themselves, but in this environment, I think it is wise to think about precisely what you're saying so that you make sure that you're safe.
So I understand what you just said about the chilling effect, but is there any, are there concrete cases where there's known, the agencies have actually harmed someone or used all the data they have, or are we just worried that they have the data?
I mean, our intelligence agencies unfortunately continue to escape the kind of legal scrutiny that I hope most of us in society would expect. I mean, just this week we found out that MI5 and MI6 have been following Eric Hobsbawm and 3 other senior, very well-known, very well-respected British historians for 35 years, listening into all of their calls and all of their conversations. We don't know whether these practices continue. Unfortunately, intelligence agencies are in the businesses of finding out information about people, and whoever comes on that list for whatever reason get looked at, and that information gets shared and passed around. I mean, I can speak about intelligence agencies in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. We're putting out a report in a month's time showing that high-profile activists and pro-democracy supporters are being expressly targeted as part of this. Privacy International represents 4 Bahrainis who are being spied on by the Bahraini government while they're at home in London, using British-made equipment that was exported to Bahrain that was then used to spy on them and remotely switch on the microphone on their mobile phone. These are people who have sought asylum in the United Kingdom and who are simply asking for their fundamental rights. I wish it was not the case that these agencies can work in this way and can put the information to that purpose, but unfortunately that is what they do.
And there's a related element to this. One of the things that we've had to struggle with at Wikipedia is government censorship around the world, and most famously in China, where we were blocked for about 3 years. And I've been to China twice to visit with the minister there. He's been to the US to visit with me. We're to a point now where they filter certain entries from Wikipedia, but broadly it's available. We're at a standoff. What's interesting is I used to be able to go and see the minister and say, you know, you're out of step with history. You're out of step with the direction the rest of the world is going. This kind of internet control, internet surveillance of everything that everyone's doing is a human rights violation which won't stand in the long run. And now they can say, yes, but your country does it. And I have no answer to that. If we go down that path, we are morally justifying much worse nations doing much worse things. And that's a huge problem. We have to take the moral high ground as societies that individuals who are not suspected of any crime should not be under surveillance as if they are criminals.
Absolutely. I think also speaking to that point, Snowden himself, through the Snowden revelations, revealed that the NSA itself abuses this information, that you have NSA employees using this information that's collected in order to stalk people that they're interested in or ex-girlfriends. That this data is collected for the specific purpose of collecting personal information on activists in order to be able to expose them. And I think this is a really important point. We're not talking about Iran, we're not talking about Bahrain, we're talking about the United States.
Hi, I was just wondering, where do you see the line with the surveillance Act? Because if you go all the way to the other side of the coin and there's no surveillance whatsoever, there will be, lack of surveillance, that information is housed in these services to prevent what you'd like to think they use it in some good, and actually prevent some events that could harm people or things like that. And where do you see that line, and what's the price of some level of privacy versus being able to stop stuff that is could harm people?
This is the funny thing about all of this to me is that I feel like my position that I've been forced to take because of the outrageousness of what's going on is actually slightly counter to where I feel like I should fall on the natural spectrum here, which is to say, I think you need probable cause. I think you need a warrant from a judge. It's very simple, and that it actually shouldn't be that hard to get it. If they've got any kind of evidence at all to say, yeah, we think this guy's a pedophile and we want to check on his communications, I don't really have any problem with that. I'm quite actually pro-law and order in that respect. And surprisingly, I'm some kind of radical anti-surveillance person, because I think you should just rampantly collect everyone's data. So I do think there is room for surveillance in society. There is room for legitimate needs of national security and law enforcement. But we're so far from that in the current situation that we can't even really get to a sensible debate about exactly how to draw that line.
There's a series of principles called the 13 Principles, necessaryandproportionate.org is the website. You can go and have a read of them. These are 300 NGOs from around the world have articulated exactly the answer to this question, which is what should the law say on this? Every single one of those NGOs says that surveillance is a right and proper activity of a society that's trying to prevent law breaking and trying to protect the people of that state. The question is how, and how do you do that properly, protecting everybody's interests and preserving the liberty that they're there to protect. We think that these principles is the line in which you draw to do it. I wish there was a state that met them. We're not there yet, but I hope in the future.
But I think that's a really important point, is that we're now at a position where what was the law before, which is you need probable cause in order to surveil a person, we've gone completely to the other end of the spectrum, which is every single one of you in this room, every single one of us is a potential criminal suspect, and we're being treated as such. And to suggest otherwise, which was the clear position on the law and clear and very well accepted position of civil liberties is now seen as a radical position. And if it weren't for the Snowden disclosures, we wouldn't even be having this debate, or this in the US having a constitutional debate. I think we probably have time for one or two more questions. One more question. Anybody else?
Yeah, how do you think the increasing usage of mobile devices and adoption will kind of affect our privacy? Because things like Tor, for example, and encryption methods typically are used on desktop devices right now. On a mobile device, it's a lot harder to get there. So, any thoughts on that?
I think it's a big problem. One of my big concerns, normally in more of an economic context, is the App Store model, which has been an incredible boon in terms of small software developers being able to innovate, and some exciting things are going on there. But at the same time, what it means is that, particularly for Apple, effectively nothing goes on your phone unless Apple approves it. And so if you want some software with open source code that gives you some kind of protection, you don't just download it from Jacob Applebaum or someone you trust in this universe. It's not so easy anymore. I think it's a huge problem. The other thing, I had this fantastic meeting with EMP David Davis, who showed me in his office a stack of papers this high, which he managed to arm twist out of his phone company, showing his geographic location for a couple months' time. I forget exactly the details, based on GPS and the phone towers he was talking to. They had all this data on everywhere he's been. I mean, it's unbelievable that we walk around with our surveillance devices in our pocket. But you think, okay, well, so what? I don't go anywhere. I don't do anything. Maybe if you're an MP and you're involved in negotiations with the other party, and maybe you're not in power, maybe whoever is in power is very interested to know whether Nick Clegg is meeting Ed Miliband. Now, we're not there yet, but the capability full well exists, and we should be very concerned about that. Ed should turn off his phone before he goes anywhere.
Unfortunately, one of the things that we found out is that GCHQ have a way of remotely switching on phones as well. It's called Paranoid Smurf.
Take out the battery.
Yeah, true.
You can't take the battery out of an Apple phone.
Oh. Leave it at home.
But the hacking of our devices by intelligence agencies is a whole different set of concerns that the film begins to touch on, but that we're only now learning about. Our intelligence agencies are now in the hacking business. They've got a series of comically named, admittedly, programs that allow them to do things like remotely switch on your phone. That's called Paranoid Smurf. Remotely switch on the microphone on your mobile phone. That's called Nosy Smurf. And it goes on. And at this point, you're literally carrying around a roving bug that can listen into your conversations of anything that's going on and take photographs of you. There is nothing in the law, there is no statutory framework that regulates the use of this technology at all. We've taken 2 cases now against GCHQ on this point, thanks to Edward Snowden. We've yet to see the response to it. But this is a debate that we should all be having. Do we think that our law enforcement should be in this game? And at the very least, we need clearly accessible legal frameworks that deal with this issue. This is something that we're refusing to acknowledge and that we must.
Well, unfortunately, we could talk about this all day long, but I want 2 quick reflections from our 2 brilliant panelists before we close. How important is this film?
Oh, it's incredibly important. I think that we are finally getting some public awareness, which I think will help put pressure on legislators to do the right thing. I mean, one of the details was, in this country, we've had this argument for the data, what's it called, the data something bill?
DRIP, Data Retention Investigatory Powers Bill.
No, the newer one that they want to pass.
The draft Data Communications Data Bill.
Yes. Policy wonk.
Snoopers Charter. Very good.
Snoopers Charter, where the main argument that you'll hear is we really need this because our ability to track people has degraded. We used to be able to know who picked up their landline at home and called who, and now we don't know anything because everybody's on the internet. It's an absolute and total lie. It's completely false. That justification for collecting even more data is just absolutely false. They have access to more data on where everybody is and who they're talking to than they ever did before. This film, I think, will help make sure that people who aren't technologists become aware of that fact, so that when you read in the newspaper, oh yes, but they need this to catch pedophiles, we'll realize it's a complete lie.
I mean, we've had a huge problem with people wanting to stay out of this debate because they think of Snowden as a traitor. I mean, I'm biased, I get that, but I don't see how anyone can watch this film and not see Snowden as, at the very least, someone that believes in his convictions and thinks he's doing the absolute best he can do for society. And regardless of whether you work for an intelligence agency or where you start off on this, you know, I look at Edward Snowden and I say, do we want more people like this in our society? Do we want more people like this in our world or fewer? And the answer has to be more. You know, we have to have more people like this who will stand up for what they believe in. You know.
Way to end this evening. Snowden said when he first came out that he was inspired by Chelsea Manning and by WikiLeaks, and we've seen, as a result of Snowden's disclosures, even more sources come forward to Laura and to Glenn, and let's hope that continues. But please join me in thanking our panellists, Jimmy Wales and Eric King from Privacy International.